away to my few remarks on the impact of the virus on the domestic situation in the US. And let me start by stating the obvious. We were just reminded the major figures, but the first obvious thing is that the situation in the United States is dire. So if we start with the sanitary front, so as of this morning, according to the New York Times, over 1 million people have been infected by the coronavirus, and at least 60,000 people have died. And on the economic front, still according to the New York Times, over 30 million workers have filed jobless claims over the past 6 weeks, which is the equivalent of the working population of approximately 25 states of the Union. On top of the sheer number of the people filing for unemployment, you need to keep in mind that this is happening so fast that the state agencies are having a lot of trouble processing the claims for unemployment, which means people are left with no emergency funding. So all of these figures bring us back, as we were just reminded, to 2 traumatic episodes in US history. The death toll in the US from the virus is now worse than that of the Vietnam War, as we were told. And the level of unemployment is now very close to what it was during the Great Depression. So the situation is not good. Now, what can we say about the consequences? I'd like to underline that the pandemic came as a shock, but it also acted first and foremost, I think, as a revelator of long-term trends and an accelerator of these same trends. Maybe the pandemic will set new dynamics in motion, but I think it's actually very early for the moment. It's not quite clear whether something really new will come out of this pandemic. Let me remind you that the pandemic is at least the third, maybe the fourth major shock for the United States since the beginning of the 21st century. The first one obviously being 9/11. The second, to my mind, being Hurricane Katrina, which I think had a lot of lessons in it that were already warnings of what is happening now. And finally, of course, the 2008 financial crisis. It's interesting for me to compare how the country has reacted to each of these shocks and to measure the difference between them, but also bear in mind that the shocks might have a cumulative effect. What can be said immediately is that after each of these shocks, the US has proved to be extraordinarily resilient on the economic front. I think we were surprised more than once. But to my mind, in terms of the social fabric or in terms of the political climate in the country, there are actually deep underlying rifts which keep growing and getting worse with each of these shocks. Which is why I'd like to ask a somewhat provocative question, which was asked by George Packer in a very good piece he just published in The Atlantic. It's in the June 2020 issue of The Atlantic. And George Packer asks, or at least he states, we are living in a failed state. So my overall question is, can the US today be said to be a failed state? Of the underlying trends I was mentioning, that the pandemic has, I think, brought to light, that it has revelated, and that it might accelerate. The first one is the pandemic highlights inequality in the US society and economy, and how this is undermining, I think, national cohesion, but also national performance. What is very obvious already is that the epidemic has hit underprivileged minorities the hardest. Okay, so the death toll is disproportionately high in the African American community, as we know, but there are also very alarming reports now coming back from Native American reservations. So there's probably a mix in these explanations, I think, are part social, but they are maybe also part genetic. Time will tell. What is obvious is that minorities are hit hardest. The epidemic has also hit harder the most exposed service workers, the invisible class, the people who power the gig economy. They need to go to work, even if there's a risk for them, and they are being hit harder, as well as medical personnel, for instance, or other categories of service workers. The pandemic has also brought out, very obviously, the loopholes in the US healthcare system. As we know, the poorest classes and the elderly are covered in the US by Medicare and Medicaid, but among the middle classes or the lower middle classes, there are still a number of people with no insurance or inefficient insurance. And that may be holding them back from seeking treatment when they need it. So I think the failings of the healthcare system in the US are now very obvious. The pandemic has, and I'm sorry for this litany of terrible news, but the pandemic has also brought out the weaknesses in public infrastructure and the differences among the different states in that regard. So unsurprisingly, when you look at the map of the US, the situation is much worse now in the urban areas on the East Coast, for instance, than in the heartland of the country. But there will be, I think, massive inequalities to be observed there as well when the situation gets better. Now, the second, I think, long-term trend that this epidemic has accelerated is that the pandemic highlights the deep crisis in political trust. Several layers of political authority are involved in handling this crisis. Mayors, governors, and of course, the federal government. This has involved some inconsistencies. It involves competition, it's testing coherence between the different policies, and there have been outright disputes and rifts between the different layers of authority. For instance, clashes between President Trump and the governor of Michigan that were very well covered by the media and maybe even exploited. So whether these different layers can work together is really a question at the moment. The crisis has also been extremely politicized by Donald Trump, first and foremost, who started by denying the crisis and describing it as a Democratic conspiracy to undermine his presidential campaign. But I think, to be honest, it needs to be said that the crisis has also been politicized by his opponents as an opportunity to criticize President Trump's mishandling of the crisis. Handling a crisis like this one, in a word, would require a competent and efficient federal bureaucracy and generally a well-functioning civil service. But the federal bureaucracy and the civil service in the United States are now weakened. Again, I think this is not new. This is long term, but it's getting worse. So they have been weakened by Reaganism, to state it briefly, that said that government is not a government is the problem, not the solution, but it does require government, obviously, to handle a crisis like this one. It's been hurt by polarization and politicization. It's been hurt by defunding. And finally, in the most recent weeks and months, I think the bureaucracy and federal government as a whole has been hurt by Trump's crusade against his own administration, which he likes to call the deep state, as we know. So this is not helping US citizens trust their government to handle the situation. So another long-term trend, and I think this is to wrap up really some of the things I was saying before, is that the pandemic reveals profound social and political divisions in the country. It's highlighting fault lines on just about every count you can think of: race, religion, region, political attitudes, values, the opposition between cities and the heartland, the issue of immigration, and also, I think, another division that has been working in the social fabric against the interests of small business versus big business. Now, Donald Trump was the worst president to think of in a crisis like this one, because since his election, Donald Trump has never tried to be a president for the whole country. He has never reached out to that part of the country that did not vote for him or try to build national unity in any kind of way. And so now this is showing, and he's just being his same old Donald Trump, trying to make every possible division worse at a time when the country would probably need some form of national cohesion. I think also the informational divide adds to this. The fact that the news coverage is so partisan, and again, this is on both sides. The fact that we've had all these debates about fake news, I think this plays a huge role in the fact that people do not trust the information they receive. The first effect of fake news, as experts show, is that it's not that people believe that the incredible stories, is that they don't believe anything anymore. And in a case of emergency, when obviously you need to believe the orders and probably respond to them, this is a huge problem. The distrust of federal government in the US is not new. Again, that's a very long-term trend. I think it's a very profound cultural thing, but it's reaching new highs at the moment, I believe. And we can see this in the number of protests there have been and civil disobedience acts against stay-at-home order. And here again, you can interpret this as a sign that American democracy is alive and well, but you could also say it's a sign that the country is coming apart. So as a conclusion, because I know we're short with time, it's still very early in the crisis to say, but I think we can make a few tentative conclusions about probable outcomes. The first one, obviously, is the US is heading towards a extremely tough economic crisis. So people are now assessing how bad it might be. Congress has passed a $2 trillion rescue package, but the rescue package, I think, is focused on helping corporations on the one hand, and it's also focused on helping individuals, but it has not focused on protecting employment as such, as opposed to what was done, for instance, in Germany or France, where the rescue packages aim to protect employment per se. So we know in the US it's easy to hire, easy to fire. But how resilient will the US economy be? Can it survive this? And especially, will small business and entrepreneurship be able to pick up, and when? I think this is really an open question. Second,
and Lorraine, can I ask you to conclude?
I have three very quick points here. Second, there's no national union or reconciliation to be expected right now. I think the political division and bitterness in the US will only increase. Third, about the 2020 elections, what does this say about the 2020 elections? I think they are as uncertain as ever. Donald Trump was counting on the good economic news, and it will be bad economic news. But at the same time, his approval ratings have been fairly stable, and especially with his voter base. The crisis has shown he's inadequate, but I don't think it's bringing Joe Biden into such a glorious light either. So it leaves people speculating about another possible surprise candidate like Andrew Cuomo, but Cuomo has said he's not interested, and I think it is just speculation. In the longer term, however, and I will finish here, I think the crisis does help set a different political agenda. I'd like to highlight that healthcare was a major issue in all of the last presidential elections. Infrastructure was also a major issue. The universal basic income was discussed in the Democratic primaries. So maybe this great cycle that started with Reagan will indeed end and something new will emerge, but we don't know yet. Final note, The US has been worried about its decline for about 30 to 40 years now, and the pandemic will only increase the trend. But I think that the perception in the US of the possibility of US decline and the reality are not really in sync. And the US could surprise us once again. Thank you very much.